Hi, I'm Dr. John Izzo, co-host of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. I was struck this weekend by two news items that appeared side by side in my news feed. The first was about the tragic rocket strike in northern Israel that landed on a soccer field, killing 12 innocent children. Israel claims the attack was from Hezbollah in Lebanon because the rocket that was used is only owned and used by them. Hezbollah denied it, but there's a pretty good chance they were involved. The second news feed was about an Israeli rocket aimed at taking out a Hamas operative that hit a tent in a designated humanitarian zone in Gaza, killing an infant, and another attack a few days earlier that had killed several innocents, including children. When I saw these two events side by side, three things occurred to me. First, it occurred to me that even after all these years of human evolution, I was saddened to realize how much war and wars are still so much a part of human society, the fabric of how we live our lives. The second thing that occurred to me was how each side feels fully justified in taking the actions that they took. Benjamin Netanyahu was in front of the US Congress this week to standing ovations and applause, saying, "Our fight is your fight and our victory is your victory." And while I do believe that Israel had the right and responsibility to react to the Hamas attacks last October, there was little or no recognition in any deep way of the tragedy of perhaps 30,000 and thousands of innocent children who have died during the conflict. And the third thing that occurred to me was to ask the question, are we willing to fight for peace? Now, as I think about this for a moment, I couldn't help but think of one of my early experiences about fighting for peace. When I was a young Presbyterian minister in the early 1980s, it was when the Cold War was still in full bore and nuclear arms were still accelerating, and there was a great fear in the United States about nuclear war. And so many churches, including my own, started peace committees, groups of concerned congregants who were asking the question, what can we do to make nuclear war less likely and peace more prevalent? And I'll never forget in one of those conversations, someone brought up the idea of the just war theory, originally started by St. Augustine, who said that while war was always wrong, sometimes war was justified because to not go to war was more noble, more morally right than to let bad things happen. Some wars were justified. And then the corollary of that is that some wars, even though justified, should be fought in a just way, meaning in a way that did the least amount of damage to innocent people. And I'll never forget in that conversation, one middle-aged man named David Moore, who was really a bright spot in so many ways, raised his hand. And he said, no, no, no. He said, this idea of just war. He said, God never intended us to kill each other. God never intended us to solve our differences by going to war or killing each other. It may be that some wars are more justified than others. It may be there are even times when going to war prevents more death and more suffering than not going to war. But we must never make the mistake of calling war just or calling killing or violence right. It is sin, even if it is a lesser sin. And as I thought about that, I thought about how important it is in this moment, first of all, for each one of us to take a stand to condemn war and violence during war in all its forms. While there may be times that we have to go to war, we must send the signal to each other, to our leaders, that this is not the way that we want to solve our differences, that we must call wrong, wrong. So I condemn the October 7th violence and the killing of citizens in southern Israel. I condemn the rocket strike that killed 12 children this week. I condemn the rocket that hit a tent and a baby died who shouldn't have died, and the other thousands of civilians and innocents, including children, who have died in Gaza. I know there are justifications for all these actions in many people's minds, but wrong is wrong, and we must condemn it. The other thing that occurred to me this week is that almost always when we fight wars, we think it will prevent wars or violence in the future. That's one of the ideas behind the just war theory. And yet, history shows us that this almost never is the case. I think of H.G. Wells during World War I, who wrote a book called The War That Ends War. And it became a kind of idealistic and promotional slogan to remind the troops of how important this war was, because this war would surely end war. But as any good student of history knows, that war did not end war. In fact, it created in its aftermath the very resentment and retribution that many historians would argue led to the Second World War in Europe, an even bloodier war than the First War. I'm sure in some ways those folks at Hamas, when they decided to attack southern Israel, felt somehow they were going to create a better future for the Palestinian people. But of course, they're wrong. Instead, thousands and thousands of civilians have died because of it. I'm sure that the leaders of Israel right now think that by decimating Hamas, they will somehow end anti-Semitism or violence against Israel. But my guess is it will only create more terrorists, more resentment that will ultimately lead to an even greater cycle of violence again and again. As Mahatma Gandhi once said, an eye for an eye only means the whole world will eventually be blind. So what do we do? First, I believe we must condemn violence and war in all its forms, even when it may be more justified than doing nothing. The second thing is we must begin to wage for peace, wage for the end to war with the same zeal and vigor that we wage war itself. A number of years ago, I had the privilege of being on the program with General Romeo Dallaire, the Canadian general who led the UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda during the period of the genocide. Many of you may have seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, in which he was played by Nick Nolte, as he desperately tried to get the world to pay attention to what was happening in Rwanda. During his talk, on which I was on the program, he asked this rhetorical question: how long will it be before we don't go to war with each other as humans? And then he answered his own question. Maybe it will be 50 years. Maybe it will be 100 years. Maybe it will be 200 years. But he said, we must never stop fighting to end war. This weekend, I went on a Bob Dylan binge. I don't know if any of you ever do that. Maybe it's because of what I read and what was going on in the world right now that I started listening to a live version of his 1962 song, Blowing in the Wind. And many people think it was an anti-war song, but it actually was a civil rights song. It was a song about maybe the answer to racial discrimination and civil rights, that finally the answer was blowing in the wind. Finally, we would come to this moment when we would be able to live together. And I couldn't help but a few poignant lines from that song. One of them is, for how many years must some people exist before they're allowed to be free? And I started thinking about the Jewish people. I grew up in New York, so I had many, many Jewish friends. My girlfriend during university for 4 years was Jewish, and her aunt and uncle were both Holocaust survivors. I listened to their riveting and compelling personal stories about the Holocaust. And I thought to myself, for how many years must the Jewish people exist before there are people in the world who hate them, who are anti-Semitic, who want to exterminate them or their state simply because they're Jewish? I also, during graduate school, got to spend time on the West Bank. I listened to the story of Palestinians about losing their homeland, about the occupation that now is 30 years later, and they still have no homeland. And I thought, for how many years must the Palestinians be without a home? For how many years must their land be occupied, even though the United Nations has recognized for years that this is not Israel's territory? And then I thought of those two other poignant lines in Bob Dylan's song. How many times must the cannonballs fly before they are forever banned? How many deaths will it take till we know that too many people have died? These are complex questions, but I believe it begins with two things. We must condemn war in all its forms, even when it seems justified. And we must fight for peace with the same vigor and the same valor, no matter how hard it is, as we wage war. We'd love to know what you think.